Hello everybody, welcome to the latest episode of the Inkwell Radio Hour. I'm Dalton Mosley.
And I'm Adam Willis. And today in this episode, we'll be featuring authors who've been published in our fall 2024 Chapbook and diving back into our archives to showcase work from the past. Additionally, we'll be featuring a special guest, an alumni from Quiz and Quill, who will be sharing some of her work with us today.
Before we begin, some announcements. Our spring writing submissions close tonight at midnight, art submissions close next week, and our upcoming event, Haiku Deathmatch, is on March 20th at Old Bag of Nails. Now for our first segment, our published readers. Our first reader today is Evie Reed. Evie is a creative writing major that enjoys writing about the queer experience and mental health. They will be reading Retransition.
Retransition. At 17, I came out as a trans man. I knew that I wasn't a girl. That much was evident from my hunched shoulders disguising my chest and the nausea I swallowed down when someone used feminine language for me. But the term man didn't feel quite right either. Like a pair of jeans a size too small. I could cram myself inside and I'd fit, but with every movement, I could feel my discomfort grow. The images of willowy white figures and button-downs in short, messy hair never translated. I'd scroll for hours, the blue light of my phone casting a ghostly glow on my face, image after image of trans-masculine people who looked nothing like me. I'd grip my supple thighs, stare at my hefty chest, and trace my soft curves. I'd look at the dusty pinks and the sage greens of my clothes. I loved my femininity, but I wasn't a girl, and boys weren't feminine, so I discarded it. Soon enough, my soft curls fell to the floor in perfect ringlets. My flowy dresses exchanged for oversized t-shirts and ratty sweats. I transitioned past my comfort zone. I ignored the line my own dysphoria drew. I injected testosterone until the reverberation in my chest condemned me to silence. I masculinized my chest, and instead of the elation I'd seen, all I felt was hollow. All under the guise of what being trans was supposed to be. At 20, I told my ex that sometimes I wished I had breasts again, small ones, that I wanted to embrace the femininity that I discarded all those years ago. So, you want to detransition? You're a girl, they asked. I was in shock. My brain stuttered to find the words. No, I said firmly, I'm not a girl. They dropped the subject, but the effects of the question still lingered. Is there only one way to be trans? Do I automatically count as a girl if I do not want everything that gender-affirming care has to offer? What does it mean to be transmasculine or non-binary? What does it mean to pass? Do I have to pass? The more questions I asked, the more confused I felt. I didn't feel like a woman, but I was also not a man. I wasn't anything. I was a body moving through space. I was a woman in the way that people say the moon is a woman. Someone associated with femininity and womanhood, but absolutely and distinctly separate from it. The idea of gender, the need for absolutes, weighed heavy on my shoulders. I pushed myself into the far reaches of femininity only to feel the dysphoria pressing hard against my chest once again. I needed to free myself from the restraint of the system Western culture upholds. Slowly, I started listening to my body. I respected the limitations of my dysphoria. I stopped forcing myself into clothing that made me shrink inward. I stopped forcing myself to wear makeup. I started wearing tight shirts that showed off my waist and baggy pants that hid the curves of my thighs. I started correcting the language people used from me. I experimented with pronouns and labels until I found that non-binary and they-them settled deep in my bones, granting me the euphoria I had always craved. I felt comfort in the liminal space between man and woman and made peace with the term detransition. I have not and will not detransition. The state of my body and my presentation does not define my transness, nor does my ability to pass. My transness is mine and cannot be taken from me.
And that piece was Retransition by Evie Reed. Evie will be presenting this piece at the Sigma Tau Delta convention in Pittsburgh this upcoming March. Good job, Evie.
Good job indeed. So Adam, what did you think about this piece?
I found it to be very timely, Dalton. I think that it speaks to our innate desire to seek identity in a world that constantly imposes it upon us. And I found it to be a very touching piece in that regard.
I particularly like the brief celestial connection with describing the moon as a woman, not necessarily a woman, but something that is associated with femininity and that entire aesthetic, and they're sort of using that and a bunch of other types of identifying ways to, forge their own identity. That's something I really admire about this piece.
Next up, we have Katharina Lee, who will be reading a piece that was published in the Fall Chapbook. Katharina Lee is a senior creative writer. She has been self-published, and she sells her chapbooks at $2 radio. So if you're looking for some good literature, stop by and pick that up.
3 minutes. An unnamed emotion is here. Tried to use share location with a friend who I haven't seen or talked to in months. Location unavailable. It's the middle of the semester. Why do I always feel this way? I don't even know. Just dropped a class. I don't have any more empathy for it. One less class to worry about. Can I run away forever? Can I start over? Wish there was a reset button. Really want some Panera. Got $9 to my name. Don't feel like going home to eat. Is life moving too fast? Or am I just getting motion sick? Might need to set up a blub appointment. I hate it. Mind's outer space, struggling to float. Am I just hungry? I hate this 8 a.m. Felt like I was going to throw up this morning. What am I feeling? God, I want pizza. Maybe I'll get a sugar daddy. Want to draw. Forgot my Apple Pencil. Does she still think of me as her friend? Working 2 jobs, going to school, still seeing her, posting with her boyfriend. Wonder if she's living her best life. Haven't done Saturday breakfast in a long time. Are we dead? Maybe I'll text her for some coffee. See if she's actually free this time. She's busy.
Dalton, I really liked that piece. I think it was quite relatable, especially the part about pizza.
Very much agree. When I first came across this piece, I was specifically drawn to the sort of like honesty that Catherine employs while writing in this particular work. And just a little side note, the comment about the sugar daddy really struck with me. Not because I also feel some need to get a sugar daddy, but simply because I thought it was absolutely hilarious and really did well to work toward the message that Catherine was presenting.
Effortlessly straddling serious and comedic topics.
Absolutely, which I think is one of their best talents and why they are one of the best writers that we have come across recently. Our next reader is Grace McKenney, who will be reading a piece written by Grace Smith. Grace Smith is a 4-year creative writing BFA student. She specializes in coming-of-age stories with fantasy and magical realism elements. Her story is inspired by Freudian themes of repression and the dream world.
Dream Journal of Louise Eldridge. September 30th. I resurrected this journal just in time for this nightmare. I dreamt that I was half underwater, sharp, ice cold, and rising. I moved my legs in circles like a bicyclist, but couldn't keep my stiffened arms above the surface. The whole thing felt midnight blue, but not in the usual serene way. It was the feeling right before letting go and falling away, or just losing the sun. October 3rd. I meant to write in here every morning. The past few nights, I've forgotten everything as soon as I wake up. The dreams slid away before I can lock them into words, their tendrils slipping between the satin fibers of my memory. I felt a kind of breathlessness upon waking through. My heart was racing this morning, like I had seen something I wasn't meant to. October 4th. It was a long dream last night. The kind that felt like an entire life. It twisted and distorted into several different settings: my basement, the front yard of my best friend's house, the space under my bed. I remember being whisked away to all these places without being able to move my legs, like a baby, being lifted and dropped wherever mother pleases. Is that a good metaphor? I want to be a poet. I know this, even though I know that I'm not very good at writing poetry, and I haven't read enough of it either. Maybe that's why I like it. I don't know enough to see everything that I am doing wrong. That before, knowing feeling is always there in my dreams. Just before I woke up, I was wandering on the shore of the same lake again. I was the only one there. The water shifted from blue to gray to white. I don't usually feel temperatures in my dreams, but I remember having goosebumps. October 6th. I haven't fallen asleep yet. It is 4 a.m., and I am on the armchair next to the couch where my father rests. It looks peaceful enough. I don't know what the argument was about, but I think he won because he had a little smirk on his face as he drifted off. My mother didn't mean to meet my father, or any man for that matter. They came to her like swarming hornets, offering her their bright, sharp edges. She fed them with the only thing she had, her starch white heart, her cool, clean hands, a wash of dewdrops on the desert road. But my father kept us safe. He reminded me of an unnamed song, the kind you remember in snippets, but never all together. I knew he loved us, even when he didn't speak. If I was more organized, I could write all this in a separate notebook. I have plenty of them, but I'm afraid to taint it with musings, with half-ideas, if it's better here, in the place where I remember the things my mind is afraid of. October 7th. It's the same lake again. I was crawling on all fours, digging into the mud, rooting myself in so I wouldn't get swept away. I've never been to a lake before, but I used to think of them as being still water, like the man-made ponds next to the grocery stores. This had ocean-height waves, industrial gray and capped in white foam. I got the sense I didn't know how to swim, even though I've had lessons. October 10th. Just woke up. Don't want to forget the details. This time, there was a boy in the water with me, around my age, dark hair, bright white face. He looked dead, even when he was still breathing, still struggling to stay above the bucking waves. He kept trying to float on his back, just like I was taught in my swimming lessons. And then, he went under. I followed, arms paddling, breathing, half full. It felt wrong not to be cold. I knew I had been there before, beneath the waves. And then, I woke up. October 11th. I spoke to my mother about the dreams that I've been having. She's never been one for breakfast table sharing, or breakfast in general, but it was all I could think about. There was a boy back home who drowned in a lake once, she said, face blank, looking out the window. I set my mug down. What? I was the first one to see it. They dredged the lake, but I don't think they ever found him. Her words were drowning, stacked against each other in a tight line. That was the end of the conversation. She quickly changed the subject, and her voice started to shift back to normal. As she spoke about the forecast for the day, she buried her hands in the column of water steaming out the tap. Her fingers swiped above and over each other, scrubbing at the red patches on her skin. I turned the water off to snap her out of it, and she didn't stop me. October 13th. I found a news story on that town. A tragic accident. A teenage boy. He was swimming at night and got stuck in the flood. The water was colder than usual, and it was raining. Only one identified witness. A young girl called the police on a payphone. A young girl who was unnamed, unsupervised, alone. I remember my mother telling me about the days before cell phones, when she could explore the outdoors until dark without her parents wondering where she was. The thought always scared me. I still dream of the lake. Now that I know where the boy is from, I see myself in the water. My mother's young face, my face, ripples over me, and she screams like a dog. I love my mother. I tell her so every morning, even when she is transfixed by the rush of scalding water over her red hands.
A wonderful story by Grace Smith. I really appreciated the Freudian themes in that. As someone who has studied a little bit of psychoanalysis, I can see the individual and cultural repressions in that story. Very interesting.
Absolutely, absolutely. And, it's readings like this that make me incredibly excited for when our generation eventually becomes like published authors and filmmakers or just creatives operating in a larger space as a whole, because we are introspective in a way that a lot of other people are afraid to be, and we so poignantly integrate emotional honesty and growth and development into our prose, and it's something really, really beautiful to see.
I couldn't agree more. Next up, we have Ren Groen, who will be reading a piece again from our chapbook, Fall Chapbook 2024, So Ren is a junior English creative writing and equine pre-veterinary studies double major. Very interesting combination there. When she is not writing, she enjoys running, hiking, helping out at resource centers, and podcasting as well. She also loves brewing jasmine pearl tea and is an avid rabbit enjoyer.
Thank you, Adam, for that introduction. I would like to tell you a little bit more about this poem before I get into it. So it's called Star Dyed, and this was a poem that was originally about my excitement for dyeing my hair orange for the first time. So I was sitting in my room, and I was looking at the mirror, and I was like, oh my gosh, I have to write this poem. And as I was writing it, I got more and more excited, but also a little bit terrified, because I was noticing as I was looking at myself in the mirror, I had some gray hairs, and I was like, oh no, this is terrifying. I'm getting older. Well, what am I going to do? So I kind of wrote this poem almost as a reflection on that, as a way to be like, okay, live in the present, and you'll be all right.
Wonderful. Let's hear it, Ren.
Alrighty. So this is called Star Dyed. I dyed my hair with a star, plucked it from the sky with tweezers and an ice cube. A master of practicality I am. Though it burned my hair to a crisp, the color of a dying leaf senescence, it was a healing change it sought for me. It hoped I'd be forever young, but I had already resigned to the forever torment of age. The star's flare grieved for me, grieved for the wrinkles that graced my skin, wept for the fine strands of silver that danced over my brow. But I grieved for the star. It did not live the life I've lived, and though it dyed my hair like youth, and sprinkled freckles, kisses of sunlight on the bridge of my nose, it could not erase the matured youth that was already there. As the rich colors of the star died from my hair, the star was reminded, once again, of the forever youth.
It's honestly really incredible how we as writers can take something so small and somewhat trivial and turn it into something that has such profound meaning and impact on the rest of our lives. I really love seeing that.
And that's beautiful, too. The imagery in that piece is wonderful.
I myself have considered like dyeing my hair before, but I never would have thought to like write an entire piece about it. But the fact that Ren was able to do that with such integrity and power, I really admire that from a creative standpoint.
Welcome back to the Quiz and Quill Radio Hour. We will be transitioning now to our second segment of the day. We will be doing a deep dive into our Quiz and Quill archives. For those who don't know, Quiz and Quill is over 100 years old. Wow, it's pretty old. It was founded in 1919, and we have literature that goes all the way back to the very first edition, archived at the Courtright Library.
Indeed. We'll be having members of our organization today be reading pieces from different genres of past issues. First up, we have Kate reading The Amber Cat by Olive Schizler from spring 1931.
Love. What a girl she was. Her slim, sinuous body was all soft curves sheathed in cloth of gold. In the half-light of a mellow lamp, she was more than beautiful. She was unreal, almost ethereal, a golden witch. Ivor's gray eyes kindled to green, and he watched the girl hungrily, yes, as one bewitched. He was always sensitive to beauty. It stirred him to the very depths of his intense soul. He watched her fingers as they wandered vagrantly over the piano keys, now languorous, now passionate. Long, slim brown fingers bewitching the ivory keys. When she'd finished her playing, she swung around easily and faced Ivor, who was watching her. With charming indifference she considered him. She, a golden witch, he under her spell. She, an amber cat toying with a mouse that was himself, waiting. But it was this indifference that tantalized him, that he swore he would break. He'd make those almond eyes plead, he'd make them shine with love for him, somehow. It was this same indifference that made him seek her out. Each time he vowed he'd torment her as she tormented him. If he was helpless, a mouse caught in the claws of an amber cat. The cat was creeping up to him. She had risen from the piano and was now curling up beside him on the divan, looking at him, watching, waiting, purring contentedly. She was laughing at him. Her cool fingertips traced the veins of his hand that was near to her. "A thoughtful boy, aren't you?" she queried lazily, arching her perfectly penciled brows. "Damn it, Jan, I'm not a boy. At 35, a man's almost old." Ivor's eyes were fixed steadily on Jan's face. He was fascinated by the way her long, amber ear pendants dangled against her creamy neck when she tilted her head back and laughed. There was magic in her laugh, the most human part of her, warm and mellow. Yet she rarely laughed. "I missed you last night, Ivor," she informed him possessively. "The devil you did!" from Ivor. "Ah, yes, I did. I played Wagner until he drove me mad, and I split a perfect nail on a final run." Jan scrutinized a jagged fingernail. "Were you with her?" she continued. "Does it matter to you?" And Ivor consulted his wristwatch frowningly. "Not especially. I just don't like her. She's so useless, like a bit of fragile china. You really don't suit her, you know." "Oh, don't I?" Ivor's voice was frigid. Jan grinned. She made him deucedly uncomfortable. Fact was, he always felt disturbed in her presence. She wouldn't give in to him, and yet she tormented him. Cat after a mouse. "At any rate, china must be very carefully handled lest it break. And she gives me the sort of feeling I like. She depends on one." Jan almost winced. He was lying, maddeningly. He hated soft creatures. They were slow, poised, unsophisticated. He wanted a woman whose will was not too easily hurt, who was not too sacrificial. Sacrifices made him feel like a cad. Jan would never make him feel that way. She'd play the game, she'd bruise him, claw him a little. But she'd love him, too. And he was as sure as he'd never been in his life before that she was for him. Jan had two moods, the one indifferent, calm, poised, the other turbulent when her strange eyes flared. He longed to see her in the latter. It was these moods that lured him, united them. And she knew it, too. Ivor was sure of that, but she wanted to claw him and annoy him until she was ready to be mastered. She demanded nothing and received everything. Now, as a nervous child, she was chewing the torn nail, viciously, and asking for a penknife, to smooth her mangled claw, Ivor thought. She fumbled with the smallest blade. Ivor did not offer to assist her. It was his turn to grin. She had thought that he would not like fragile china. He rose from the divan and picked up his hat. "I really must go now, Janet. I've another entanglement. You'll pardon me if the knife doesn't matter. Goodbye." "Janet!" Ivor had never called her that, not even when they first met, when she had first known that she loved him, known that he must not know. She who prided herself on poise and sophistication. There was no answering farewell from Jan, but when Ivor had reached the door there was a cry of pain, and he rushed back to the divan where she was looking helplessly at a cut finger. There were actual tears on Jan's cheeks. Crimson blood dropped unheeded on a dress of gold. There was witchery in Jan's tears. They transformed her face from that of an amber cat to that of a woman's, soft, helpless. There was witchery in the feel of her full lips upon his, her tears on his cheeks, her arms about his neck, but most of all, in her unsophisticated surrender.
Interesting piece, 100%. One of the things I really, really love about the archive readings is how they showcase the sort of timelessness of art itself. I mean, despite the difference in time period, the piece that was just read and some of the pieces we see in our current issues, they interrogate different themes and maybe even different concepts that we encounter in society, but overall they approach them with a level of honesty of expression that is really cool to see, just woven throughout history. It's as far back as 1931 and as far up as here now in 2025, and we are still expressing ourselves through art. I love that.
I cannot agree more, Dalton. And if I might add a little tidbit, it seems like back then they had a fascination with cats as we do today.
Yeah, there's something I noticed, in my time in Quiz and Cool, just like there's something about being an English major that draws us to cats, or at the very least being interested in art that draws us to cats. And I wonder what the shall we say, ethereal or spiritual significance or connection between English majors and cats there is, or artsy people and cats there is. I don't know if any science has been done on that, but I'd be interested to find out.
We'll leave that up to the zoologist.
100%.
Next up, we have Mars, who will be reading the piece Unhinged by Jackie Smith. This is a poem that was featured in the spring 2009 edition of Quiz and Quill.
Unhinged. The girls clutched their plastic cups with softened ice and hardened smiles, swaying on the incline, waving to the false rhythm those deaf ears pick up. They're the ones with rings on their fingers now, the ones who hang themselves upon their own knitted scarves, who feel the need to prove their golden scales, announcing, "I'm beautiful. I'm interesting." Your aesthetics are overrated, darling. The wolves lift the red lace veils, and I'd rather watch the trees strip themselves down, rather strip myself down, for you. Rather find some sincerity from a new pair of eyes in this plastic-coated world. I may not be the most beautiful with petals melting from my hands, red wax caked in, the crevices underneath uneven fingernails. I may not be the kind of girl who is considered interesting, dandelion seeds planted in the sharpness of your clavicle. But I have more passion, more fire, in this aching heart of mine, than most do in their entire bodies. I breathe in a little deeper, laugh a little louder. If you can't see that, then your blindness is astounding. Blindfolded by boulders, sandpaper between your teeth. I'm shameless and tangled, threadbare, stained, frayed at my seams, announcing my arrival with candy wrappers spilling from my shoes, stumbling, and murky with liquor on my breath. But if you explore the setting skies with the rusting, creaking telescope, you'll never find one as honest, as true to the beating of her pulse as this little bird. These knees are stinging, skinned, and bruised, but I'll get it right, eventually.
A wonderful and powerful piece, I'd say. I really was attracted to all of those textual details. I saw, I felt my nose being assaulted, my skin being assaulted, my eyes being assaulted by all these wonderful, wonderful images. What do you make of that, Dalton?
I couldn't agree more. Honestly, it perfectly relates to something I was thinking about during the reading, and it's just how the entire piece is working with a different definition of the word unhinged compared to like the way we use it now in 2025. It's honestly really impressive how nowadays in our collective cultural consciousness, words can begin to take on different meanings. Nowadays, in 2025, most people use the word unhinged in a humorous way or in a joking way to evoke someone who is, bubbly or just has a lot of energy. But in this piece in particular, the word unhinged relates to unbounded. It relates to freedom. Just not just the freedom of expression, but also the freedom to notice all of these, textual details that you were just commenting on. And when I read it, when I hear it, I find myself having a greater appreciation of those very small things, in this world around me. That in of itself is the power of art.
I agree. The juxtaposition, or rather subversion of that word is very striking.
Next, we will be having Freddie reading Hiroshima Sushi by Becca Rossiter from spring 2004.
Hiroshima Sushi. On the anniversary of Ash, I sit, watching your delicate bird hands stir cold wasabi into carp-shaped dishes of soy sauce. A televised baseball game in the background, your spontaneous laughter, an everyday restaurant conversation on a day when hearts literally burned. It takes 1,000 folded paper cranes to send a wish up to the heavens. One sits on your car dashboard, a limp red promise. I try not to think about the flesh of the fallen schoolgirls as you offer me the salmon with rice that sticks to my fingers, or the delicate pickled ginger. In Japan, we do not tell our children we love them. They know it already. They already feel it. Behind the glass counter, shrimp and eel, great slabs of tuna, you want me to try them all. My blonde reflection still as you confess you changed your name to something more pronounceable when you moved here more than 20 years before I was born, how you used the dictionary to speak with your new American husband, whispered Kyoto lullabies into the seashell ears of your babies only until they were old enough to understand. Then you became the wife in the cul-de-sac, the mother with soccer uniforms and chilled summer salads, and now only mourn for Kigakiku, love shown without words, in the middle of the night and when the sharp, creased shoulders of paper birds are borne into your hands.
I absolutely love that piece. I mean, when you consider, art itself, art is one of the primary foundations of what we know to be culture, or one of the primary associations that we have when it comes to our definition of culture. So I absolutely love when an artist is able to inject culture and history into their piece to create something profound and almost transgressive in a way.
I agree with that, Dalton. I was really struck by the piece again. I feel like I always say this when I'm talking to you. The imagery is just wonderful in that piece. The specific ingredients and the glass counter, I believe, was one image that came up. Oh, yeah. But then hearing it read aloud, because it really is a wonderful spoken word piece. Absolutely. I get so much more out of it hearing it aloud. This idea of like erasure, cultural erasure, both in Japan and in America. Such an interesting theme.
Yeah, 100%. It reminded me of just to make an artistic connection. It reminded me of a song I heard entitled Kenji by a rap artist named Mike Shinoda, where Mike Shinoda is a Japanese American, and in that song he speaks about the experience of being a Japanese American in America, post World War II, from the perspective of a sort of fictional character by the name of Kenji. And through Kenji, he talks about his own personal experience, and it's some of the most poignant and profound work that you can ever, encounter. I was particularly drawn to one line from the poem. In Japan, we don't tell our children we love them. They know already.
That struck me as well.
I feel like that line, speaks for itself.
Lastly, we will have Mars coming back into the studio again. Mars will be reading The American Girl. This is by Mary Tinsman. This is from spring 1920. This is the second issue of Quiz and Quill ever conceived.
The American Girl. The future of America is hidden in the hearts and the minds of the young women of our land. Never has so much responsibility been placed on the American girl, and never has she had an opportunity to face up. Each day, new responsibilities are being placed upon her shoulders. Constantly, there is added something new to her schedule, and as the days go swiftly by, she learns a new method for making someone happy, or another way in which she can make herself of service to humanity. She dares not be idle a moment, nor does she desire it. Those who today grieve that the modern girl is now like her grandmother may as well cease laminating. We may be sure that our grandmothers of yesterday would be glad to live again in these freer times, and that they would need the responsibilities make the most of their opportunities with as much enthusiasm as in their own day. To get a picture of our foremothers, we turn to a few lines from the Courtsmanship of Miles Standish. So through the Plymouth woods, John Outland went on his errand, heard as he drew near the door the musical voice of Priscilla, singing the 100th Psalm, the grand old Puritan anthem. Then, as he opened the door, he beheld the form of the maiden, seated beside her wheel, and the carded wool like a snowdrift, piled at her knee, her white hand feeding the ravenous spindle. While her foot on the treadle, she guided the wheel in its motion. Open wide on her lap lay the well-worn psalm books of Ainsworth, printed in Amsterdam, the words and the music together. Rough-hewn angular notes like stones in the wall of a churchyard, darkened and overhung by the running vine of the verses. Such was the book whose pages she sang the old Puritan album. She, the Puritan girl in the solitude of the forest, making the humble house and the modest apparel of homespun. Beautiful with her beauty and rich with the wealth of her being. Priscilla at her spinning wheel is very picturesque, but seen today portrays more the hardships of the pioneer woman than romance. We look upon the picture with admiration and wistfulness, grateful for her courage and valiant heart, but rejoicing that we are privileged to live in our later days, when our minds and our hearts can turn to other things than those of our pioneer mothers. Today, the American girl needs not spin and weave her clothes. That is done for her in this period of a bustling industrial activity. She gives more time and thought to the questions of how to live and how she can help others live, how she can make this old world a friendly place for those less fortunate than she. Just in very recent years, she has extended her activities and directions, and to a degree undreamed by the women and the mothers who in the former years presented such inspiring examples to their own and future generations. The girl of today realizes that her position compares in a very few ways only with that of her grandmother. She has lived through the Great World War, the effects of which we are now just being so keenly felt. She recalls all those tasks which fell into the lot of herself and her sisters. She is not all frivolous as some people would have us think. She has proved it in her splendid service at the front, in the hospitals, huts, home camp, and all the work she undertook, including the various drives of local, state, and interstate organizations. And she did her duty well. There is no typical American girl. Individuality has never before been so exudated as in contemporary American womanhood. In any of the larger cities during the noon hour, the main streets may be seen crowded with girls from factories, from stores, and from offices. These girls prefer not to be called economic factors, but rather earnest, striving, and hopeful human beings. They are the embodiment of the spirit of American girlhood. The modern girl has her own terms with life, and she is not to be cheated in her bargaining. She demands more of the world than her grandmother did, but exacts just as much more of herself. She has many interests outside the home. Her name is on the roster of individual guilds, civic improvements, clubs, social services, and religious societies, where her influence radiates indefinitely. Her one ambition is to make for future generations a greater America than is the America of our time. She is merely striving for the good of her country, just as her grandmothers did before her. The only difference is that the girl of today has so much more ground upon which to build. When Alex de Tocqueville made his celebrated tour of the United States, one of the things which most deeply impressed him was the respect paid to the women of the country. He afterwards wrote, "In the United States, men seldom compliment women, but they daily show how much they esteem themselves. Many of the foreign visitors have made similar remarks, but to anyone familiar with the so-called inner history of our land, there is nothing surprising at the attitude of the American man to the American woman. It is largely the impression of an inherited and instinctive appreciation for the notable part women has played in the shaping the destinies of America." De Tocqueville himself, he had at least a glimpse of the truth when he said, "If I were asked what the singularity, prosperity, and growing strength of the American people ought to mainly be attributed to, I should reply to the superiority of their women. What greater tribute could we ask, whether of a girl of ourselves today or yesterday?"
Very timely manifesto, Dalton. I think very powerful. The message that comes across, again, as you said before, how things from the past can still, be seen or apply today. Very, very moving piece.
I am particularly fond of the concept of the pioneering foremothers that the story delineates and the balance it strikes between treating these, pioneering, trailblazing figures that have had such an impact on our history with reverence, but also, having the humility and understanding that these people were also, people. They were humans with flaws and, ideals and morals, and they made mistakes. They had great successes. They had great failures. It's that sort of as close as we can get to objectivity when it comes to viewing these people who have had an impact on our country that is really, really beautiful to see.
I couldn't agree more, Dalton. Welcome back to the Quiz and Quill Radio Hour. It is with great pleasure that I welcome our guest speaker today, guest poet, Madison Newman. Madison, while at Otterbein University, Madison was a triple major in English, sociology, and gender studies. And she used that work to forward her passions for writing and advocacy.
Nowadays, when she's not writing, Madison enjoys reading, cooking, making art, being outside, and hanging out with her lovely cat, Zelda. We are so excited to have her here, and she'll be sharing some of her best poems with us.
Hi, guys. Thank you so much for having me. It's so great to see both of you. All right, so the first one I'm going to be reading is called I Grab a Drink with the Ghost of Jules de Bonnier, and it starts with a little historical fact. Jules de Bonnier, 1673 to 1706, was an internationally famous, openly queer opera singer with the French opera from 1690 to 1694. Her hobbies include challenging men to sword duels dressed as a man, burning down nunneries, and romancing noble people. Her death date is more so a disappearance date. Has her infamous globe-trotting lifestyle erased her true death date from history? I grab drinks with the ghost of Jules de Bonnier, and when I slide her the glass, she says, "You look like somebody who loves a good story." I never wanted to be remarkable. I just wanted to be feared, and sometimes the only way to keep existing in a body is to do so fearsomely. I let the rumors truth themselves until I became a figment, then re-rumor themselves until I became a man. I insisted my death date rebirth me into another body when I'd worn the old one out at the elbows. She's wearing a men's bomber and cowboy boots, 2 sizes too big, blonde hair down to the small of her back, twisting like flames. I ask her about fencing and singing opera, and whether the burnt remains of the Alger nunnery were the result of love or spite or another holy ghost entirely. You told me you're a writer, she says. I tore out my own pre-written pages, wrote myself just enough woman to be doubted, just enough man to be safe. I don't know how to live in these bones without the ritual destruction of a sword and a love I shouldn't have. But every time, it ends just as you'd expect it to. Almost every time, one way or another, it ends in flames. I followed her out onto the patio and watched her smoke a cigarette. She doesn't offer me one, and I don't ask. I focus on the dirty yellow filter, the searing ash still hell orange and growling. I give it its space. This woman has never not been armed. This woman has never not been running. Let's burn something down together sometime, she says, smoke furling out of her mouth like a collapsed roof, a vapor promise. I might stay this time, at least until the coals stop smoldering. Next one is titled Self-Care, after Solmaz Sharif. Have you tried lavender oil, eucalyptus, a mix of the two, standing with your face over the cracked open mouth of the dishwasher as it powers down, letting the steam erase your nose's memory of how to take in a breath? Have you tried pomegranate juice, kale chips, chicken liver, screaming in downward dog until the sliver of air between your face and the floor mat, throwing a glass, watching it shatter into tiny pieces of lethal confetti? Have you tried therapy, cryo, massage, retail? Filling the bathtub with amethyst and rose quartz that sat out under the moon for a while, letting yourself drown in the sparkle of your own weight? Have you tried emptying your bank account, licking up the pennies like crumbs on a dessert plate, inhaling a cloud of perfume, painting on a gash of red lipstick, pacing the room in stilettos until your heels convince themselves they've never known the ground? Have you tried convincing your conscience you're someone worth siding with? Have you tried staring your own face down in the mirror, figuring out how to welcome every part of yourself home? Have you tried forgiving it all, starting again?
2 wonderful poems by Madison Newman. I've always considered poetry to be a kind of hysterical genre in the Lacanian sense. It's something which imposes the reader to experience, specific emotions and evoke specific emotions in the reader. And listening to you read those poems, I get the sensation of restlessness and kind of relief that come in these specific waves. I don't know, Dalton, do you experience the same thing?
I 100% do. I mean, I can only come at this from the perspective of a prose writer, but one thing I do admire about poetry is that despite how sort of confined it is to form and length, there's still so much you can pack into it. And Madison, you are one of the most preeminent poets I've ever had the pleasure of meeting and interacting with. So we have a couple questions for you.
Absolutely.
As far as your writing goes. First one, the character of, and I hope I pronounced this right,
Juliet de Bonnier.
Juliet de Bonnier?
Yes.
That's how you pronounce that?
Yes. Great job.
So that character is central to your work.
Yes.
How did you discover this historical figure, and what kind of personal connection do you have?
So, a couple years ago, I was listening to a podcast. I can't remember the name of the podcast, but it was an episode specifically on forgotten figures in queer history. And I myself identify as queer, so this was just such an interesting topic for me, because people, especially with the political climate now, are always acting like queer people are brand new, when in fact we've been around for ever since history began. And so I discovered the figure of Juliet de Bonnier through this podcast, and I was just enamored. I just thought that she was the coolest person ever, and she just had a little segment on this podcast that was full of discussions of various queer historical figures from all over the world, and I wanted to know more about her. And so I dug up all of the information that I could on her, and I was inspired by a poem that I read by a poet called Dante Emile, who wrote a poem about a modern-day Joan of Arc. And modern-day Joan of Arc that this poet meets on the streets of New York City, and they have a conversation. And I said, that's an idea. And so fast off the heels of finding out about Juliet de Bonnier, I said, I need to have a conversation with her. Like, I need to reach into the facts that I knew about her, and I read her diary entries that were published. I read all the reports on her. And the thing that really stuck out to me was that she doesn't have a confirmed death date.
She could still be around today.
I don't think quite, but she has kind of a date where that was the last time anybody heard from her, and she had a wild 15 years. Like, she was bopping around with the opera. She was fighting men in sword duels. She was burning down convents to break women out of convents. She was wild 10 years, 15 years. And then, as far as sources say, she got married, moved out of France, and no one ever heard from her again. Wow. And so I wanted to kind of imagine more of a subtler version of her coming back to the modern day and sitting at the bar, having a drink with her, and just while she reminisces about that wild time in her life. And yeah, that was kind of where I was going with it.
It's very interesting that you say a subtle or a more subtle version of her, because everything you just said does not strike me as subtle. And I gotta wonder, like, what kind of man must her husband have been to ensnare her heart like that?
Right.
And she's so just like powerful and impactful, and she's dueling people in the streets. Like, hey.
Right. And there wasn't really a lot on her husband. So that might, I don't know, maybe that says something about how private he is. That might say something about how wild and just out there she was. So yeah, but I really struck a chord with, like I said, the queerness of her story, just, and how forward and so incredibly herself that she was even back in the 1600s. And people, like I said, act like the people existing outside the norm didn't exist back in the 1600s, 1700s. So the fact that her story is documented to the extent that it is really, really made me like enamored with her as a figure.
Right.
Now, Madison, I know both from this poem and from other poems you've written golden shovels and other ones that use epigraphs from other poets. You often sample or refer to or reference these other creatives. I was wondering if you could speak on the way that you write in response or in conversation with these poets, and for those young writers out there like myself, what sort of kind of creative value does one get from that practice?
Absolutely. So when people ask me where I draw my inspiration from and why I am in conversation with, why I do so many quote afters, why I reference so many other writers, poets, is the way that we learn to write poetry as poets is to read and to listen and to be inspired by other people. My first inspiration was the poet Andrea Gibson. If you have not read them, absolutely 100% pick up one of their collections. Definitely recommend first Lord of the Butterflies. That was because I hated poetry. I thought that it was pretentious. I thought that it was saying things in a way that was convoluted and not necessary.
All the stereotypes.
Right. And then I picked up Lord of the Butterflies by Andrea Gibson my junior year of high school, and I fell in love with the genre. I discovered that it could be to the point, that it could be vulnerable, that it didn't have to be flowery and pretentious and all of the stereotypes of poetry that they have you read, Shakespeare and Wordsworth and all of the old British guys when you're in like honors or AP English classes in high school. So to answer Adam's question about being in conversation with other poets, I think that it's incredibly important to not only take inspiration from creatives that have kind of paved the way for you, but also to recall upon their work and see what you can do to reinvent it. Writing, and I think, I can't remember if it was Hemingway. It might have been Hemingway, but it was a good writers borrow, great writers steal is definitely a quote that I go by. Might be Hemingway, it might not, don't quote me on that. But I think that is definitely something that a lot of writers and artists, anybody who's a creative, should follow. As long as you credit, it's always like an after, it's always in the acknowledgments, etc. Whenever I borrow a line or an idea from another poet or writer. But just being able to reflect on the poets that come before you and pay homage to them while also adding to kind of keep the cycle alive, so to speak, is really important to me as an artist.
Indeed. Last question for you. So you seem to interrogate, multiple different kinds of self-care in your work. In particular, you present each sort of self-care method in the form of a question. So we were really curious, is your intent to sort of like discredit or deconstruct like the value of these self-care methods? Perhaps interrogate.
Mm-hmm.
And if so, what does true self-care to you look like?
Okay, that's a great question. So yes, actually, my intent with this poem was to interrogate and kind of deconstruct these different self-care methods, because my intent with this poem was to really reflect on the mindset of mental health issues or mental health struggles, whether they be stemming from medical, environmental, social elements, is that people, when you're saying, oh, I'm feeling anxious, I'm feeling depressed, I'm feeling just not right with myself, people will say, you should drink more water, you should go for a walk, you should charge your crystals in the full moon. And it's like, that's not what solves things about this. Like, yes, going for a walk and drinking more water and charging your crystals and doing all the other things that you might take comfort from is a good step in the right direction, but it's not going to solve any of your problems. What's going to solve your problems, real self-care to me, is community, is connection and is being okay with taking refuge in yourself and knowing when it's time to take a time out. And so the ending lines of this poem, I think, are the only ones that aren't kind of ridiculing the stereotypical vision of self-care. The standing in the mirror, getting right with your conscience, and deciding whether or not you want to start again. And I wanted to leave the poem on a hopeful note, even though I spent the entire thing ridiculing self-care methods. I wanted to leave the process on a hopeful note in the way that tomorrow's a new day and you can always start again. And so, yeah, I think that pretty much covers it.
And it's presented kind of in the form of a question, like we said, too. And that goes back to your point of, like, it has to be your choice to do that.
Absolutely.
And, I mean, you can't have change unless you choose. So,
yes,
very,
absolutely.
very, very timely, I'd say.
Very much so.
Yes.
Well, that is all we have for you, Madison. Thank you so much for taking the time out of your day, your week, your month, for coming back and sharing your work with us. We're always delighted to see you. We're always delighted to have you here. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Would you like to talk about any of your current literary projects? Are you doing anything of that sort right now?
Let's see. I mean, I am still very active in the Columbus spoken word community. Cafe Kerouac specifically, Wednesday nights at 8. Cafe Kerouac puts on a $5 at the door spoken word open mic. You can read, you can just sit and listen, you know. And this is something that fellow members of Quiz and Quill introduced me to, and that I've kept going to ever since I found out about it when I was still in school. And so it's become a really great space for poets, both spoken and written word poets in the Columbus area. You know, I'm between my work and keeping up with my apartment and everything. I have been trying to write more. That is something that I put down on my 2025 plan, is to absolutely write more, and hopefully there might be a collection coming in the future. So I'm excited.
Well, keep us in the loop. I don't know about you, Dalton, but I need to hear more of this.
100%. Very much looking forward to that.
Yes, thank you so much, you guys, for having me. It was wonderful to see you both.
Thank you for being here. And that is our latest episode of the Inkwell Radio Hour. As a quick reminder, some announcements. Art submissions close next week. Spring writing submissions close tonight at midnight. And Haiku Deathmatch is on March 20th at Old Bag of Nails. Be sure to tune in for our next episode.